Welcome to the Stories with Traction podcast. I'm your host, Matt Zahn. Thank you for joining us as we uncover how stories are one of the most important aspects of your business. We'll talk about struggles, victories, and how you can utilize strategic storytelling to inspire those around you to action. Enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Stories with Traction podcast. I'm your host, Matt Zahn. Today, I am joined by Joe D'Antonio. And the reason why I wanted to bring Joe on was actually for a few reasons. So I met Joe last year. I had the opportunity to speak to an organization that he is a leader in. He is the director of sales at Drug Plastics and Glass Company. And I had the opportunity to speak to his sales representatives, and it was fantastic. But what was interesting to me was the conversations I had with Joe leading up to that meeting. I was fascinated by his ability to storytell. And then when Joe told me that he was an author, I wasn't surprised by that because of his ability to connect. So Joe, I want to dive into what you do and also writing as well. I think a lot of people are going to be interested in your creative process and what sparked a desire in you to write. But thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate your time. And what's happening in your world right now?
Well, from a work standpoint, we remain very busy. Our primary focus is pharmaceutical packaging. So, needless to say, there's a lot of packaging required for the medications that are needed at this time in our history, if you will. And so we've been very busy in that regard. From a personal standpoint, I continue to write. I always cut out some time every day to work on some projects that I'm working on. I have a new novel in edits right now with my publisher, so that's a very arduous process. Sometimes I think writing the book is easier than getting it edited. And so I'm going through that process right now, but I thoroughly enjoy it. For me, it's how I kind of break away from the 10 to 12 hours a day that I work. So for me, it's just a way to kind of set that side of myself aside, get away from it for a while, and get into what I perceive to be my more creative side.
Yeah, and so it was fascinating to me when I wasn't surprised, but then I was surprised when I found out that you were an author. So I wasn't surprised because of your ability to connect and storytell. So it made sense that you've written published work. So that wasn't surprising to me. But what was surprising was the timing element. You had mentioned 10 to 12 hours a day. You have a very deep business background. So it was interesting that you carved out time to do this. So I want to dive a little bit into your background. So right now, you're definitely focused on business and providing a tremendous amount of value to the clients that you have, that your company represents. But tell us a little bit about that journey. So you studied business in school, and then clearly you went into business. During that process, was there something that sparked writing in you? Was there a big aha moment where you can backtrack and say, this was the moment that I realized that creativity was bursting through writing?
Difficult. I have to go back a little bit. As you said, I do have a business background. In undergraduate school, I was a history major, and after leaving college, I did teach history for a couple of years. Decided that was not for me. Went into the business world. I've had some incredible opportunities in my business life. I spent quite a long time at Bristol Myers Squibb In fact, I was at Squibb, and I was there when Bristol Myers bought them. I also spent a considerable bit of time at General Motors and doing a variety of jobs with them. And then after leaving there, I went into my own business. I went into a business with two partners. It was a small medical device startup company. So I've kind of run the gamut, if you will, from the big super corporations, big super global corporations, to managing my own small startup, that sort of thing. But there was always a part of me that found writing as a release, if you will, as an escape mechanism more than anything, because it provided me the opportunity to sort of set aside. I think I learned a long time ago. Someone told me your brain's divided into two parts: your right and your left brain. And your left brain is sort of that practical, business, everyday kind of person. And I found that I lived in that part of my brain most of the time. And to get away from that, to get into my more creative right brain size, if you will, writing seemed to be the perfect escape mechanism for me. I've always been fascinated by words. I've always been fascinated by people who can put them together. I've always been an avid reader, and I have to tell you a little bit about that too, because when I decided that I wanted to start to write, one of the things that I actually found was that I had to curb my reading, because when I first started out, I would read somebody's work, and then I would find myself sort of almost unconsciously trying to duplicate their style, if you will, or the way they put a story together. And so one of the things that I had to do on my journey was find my own voice. And so I did that by just doing a tremendous amount of writing. But again, the most important thing for me was just the wonderful escape that it provided me. It was a place where I could go and no one could bother me. It was my private little world. And in that world, I could be anybody that I wanted to. I could do anything that I wanted to. And all of it just by sort of putting it on paper. As I progressed in that part of my, as my writing progressed, I got an interest in a couple of subject areas that I thought that I wanted to build stories around, and that was very helpful for me. So again, as I say, there's just this whole escape mechanism, if you will.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that. And what's interesting to me is, so right now I'm currently in the midst of reading a lot of biographies. So I'm reading a lot about different leaders and, leaders in business, political leaders, historical leaders. And one of the common threads that I see with all of these individuals is they have curiosity. They're incredible when it comes to observation. And then they take those observations and they really allow their creative juices to do something with those observations. So it sounds a lot like that with what you're saying with me, that you basically, you were a history major, you had a passion for providing value to your clients. So you ended up going in the business world, but you still had this curiosity regarding words that led you to observe different things that led to the creative process of your writing. And I think that that's fascinating. And my question to you is, there are people that are going to listen to this that they want so desperately to actually publish a book, but for whatever reason, whether life got in the way or they had anxiety with putting the book together, they don't exactly know where to start. So if you can backtrack and think back to the early stages of your writing, what advice would you give someone that they know they have something inside them that they have to tell the world through the written word, but they don't quite know where to start? What would you tell that individual?
Well, good question, because it sparks in my mind a lot of thought. One of the most important fundamental things and it was something that somebody told me when I first started off on my journey as a writer. In fact, the person that told this to me is the subject of the book that's now in edits with my publisher. But the person looked at me and said, "You know, Joe, writers write." And as simple as that sounded, there was a tremendous amount of inspiration in that, if you will. There's a tremendous amount of motivation that it's a craft and you have to work at it. And what I found is that yes, writers write and you have to take the time to do it. Now, I will tell you this: I never started out anything that I ever wrote. The novels that I've worked on, the most recent novel of mine that you read recently, Not Spoken of the Soul, I never started out with the intention of publishing it. It was always, I always did it for me, because remember, the more important value that I got out of it was the escape that it provided me, was the break, if you will, from the crush of the responsibilities, if you will, that I have both as a parent, and then, of course, later on as a leader in the business community. I've held some pretty high-profile jobs in my career that had a lot of pressure on, and I knew I had to find a way to break away from that. So again, for me, the writing was never about necessarily saying to myself, "Oh, I'm gonna write this and I'm gonna publish something." Okay. Now, why did I eventually decide that to publish? I thought at one point in time I would share my work with a lot of people, and the feedback that I was getting was that you really need to share this. You're a good storyteller. You have a lot to offer, a lot to say, and I thought that okay, I'll take a shot at that, if you will. My first couple attempts were not really that successful. You mentioned one other thing, and in terms of creativity, and as I was thinking, as I was kind of preparing myself for speaking to you today, I thought about that word creativity, and interestingly enough, I wrote a couple of things. How would I define creativity? And at the top of my list was curiosity. That has always been the driver for me. I've always been curious about how things work, why people do the things they do, how they think about things, and I like to take a lot of that and incorporate it into my work. Not Spoken of the Soul has an interesting history. It all started from, I was watching a TV show one day, and it was on the History Channel, and it was a story about Tom Dewey, who was the special prosecutor in New York City. Later became the governor of New York, very famous for prosecuting the criminal mafia boss, Lucky Luciano. And one of the things that was raised in that show was, they said that Dewey spent 8 years trying to put Luciano in jail. He finally did it. He put him away for 30 years. Luciano got locked up in Dannemora, which is in upstate New York, for 30 years, and everybody thought it was done. And then, interestingly enough, fast forward to 1945, Dewey is the governor, and he releases Luciano from jail and deports him after Luciano had only served, I believe, 7 or 8 years of a 30-year sentence. And the question that was raised in that show was, why? What happened? What happened in that interim that he spent a good deal of his life trying to put him in jail and then later let him loose? And that just drove my curiosity wild, because all they did in the show was ask the question. They didn't answer the question. And so I said to myself, well, number one, I got to find an answer for this. And as I dug into it, as I really started researching it, because my writing format is historical fiction, so about 90% of what you read in my works are historically accurate events. They actually happened. But then what I do is I take a fictitious character, inject them into the story, and create sort of an alternate history, if you will, another outcome. So that's what kind of led me. It was just a real spark of curiosity that led me to write this story that I wrote, centered around Luciano, my theory as to why he actually did get pardoned. I think I found the actual reason for it, and then centered around a historical event that happened in February of 1942, just a couple of months after Pearl Harbor, and that was the sinking of the Normandy in New York City. So taking that event, building around it, the sort of all the mystery about Luciano getting out of jail and what really happened and why was he sent back to Italy and all that sort of stuff, just it was just a wonderful experience for me to do the research, to write about it, and certainly into my natural tendency just to be curious about a lot of things.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that you brought up those two words, curiosity and creativity. And I want to talk about that a little bit because I do, based on conversations you and I have had going back to last year, one of the things that was really interesting to me is the way you lead your team and creating the environment for them to be curious and for them to be creative. And I feel like there's a lot of business leaders out there that for whatever reason, they don't create that environment. And you've mentioned to me in the past that the company that you work for has had a lot of different curiosity with how to make things better for your clients. And because of that company culture of creativity and creativity, you not only did well last year, but you're doing extremely well this year, providing value to your clients. So I want you to talk about that a little bit, because I think this, you'd mentioned that it started out as a way to relieve stress, and then it really got your creative juices flowing, and it sparked this intense curiosity. We could even call it an obsession, right? And I have a tendency to do that as well, where I become so curious, I dig into things and I read and I do everything I can to study. How has that changed the game for you when it comes to leadership? Have you noticed that because of this curiosity, do you think you subconsciously do that, or do you think that you really directly have created this company culture of curiosity and creativity?
Well, again, I think I was put into an environment that they realized, they were far enough ahead of the game where they realized that something was missing, that they had become fairly programmed in their approach to things. There wasn't a lot of questioning as to why they were doing the things they were doing, and even more importantly, how they were doing them. I was brought in primarily because I had a lot of experience in dealing with these issues in other jobs that I had. Just as an example, when I was at General Motors, one of the jobs that I had was I was the brand manager for the electric car program, and they had a series of people there that were running that program that came out of Chevy, or they came out of Buick, or they came out of Cadillac. And what they didn't realize is that the paradigm had shifted with that vehicle. They weren't going to sell that vehicle like a Chevy. And interestingly enough, one of the reasons that we were successful with that particular program and meeting the goals that we had set forth in that program was that I was not locked in the car box. I didn't grow up in General Motors. So I was able to sort of look at it a little differently. And then you top it all off with a person who has, in myself, has a very vivid imagination. One of my favorite authors is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer of the Sherlock Holmes stories. And I remember one time there was a quote in one of his stories about Holmes was asked, "Well, how do you solve these crimes? How are you able to sort of do all of this?" And his answer was, I thought, very provoking. He said, the first thing I do is I eliminate the impossible. He said, then I consider the improbable, no matter how impossible it may be. And that almost became a management mantra for me, if you will. That, yeah, let's get rid of the things that we know are impossible. But now let's start engaging in dialogue here about what's possible. And I don't care how improbable it may seem. Let's talk about it. Let's throw it around. That mixed with what I consider to be a very deep-rooted servant leadership style that I've always considered myself. I would say that when I look at my sales team, for instance, one of the things that always sticks in the back of my mind, and I'm not sure I would ever say this out loud to them, but I look at them and I go, boy, without you, they don't need me. And therein sort of lies lies my motivation, if you will, that I need to be of service to these guys. I need to help them. I need to be able to give them a place where they can come to me and we can sort of flesh out problems and difficulties that they may be having. How do I move this forward? How do I do that sort of thing? And in helping them be successful, the organization is successful, we meet our goals, and then by default, I'm successful. You mentioned one thing. I think there's a lot of business leaders out there that they're still, they feel it's almost as if they feel they still have to control everything. And letting go of that control that they feel that they need to have, I think that's the key to opening the door, if you will, to a more creative process, a more interactive process, a more servant leadership style of management, if you will. And all of this, of course, I think plays very much into one of the reasons why I like to write, because again, it helps me get out of thinking about things in a particular way. It sort of lights up my imagination, if you will.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And you gave us a lot to unpack. So one of the things that I thought of when you were saying about the impossible and making it improbable, and then figuring out from that improbable how to make it a reality, was you also mentioned earlier in the conversation the difference between writing and editing. And correct me if I'm wrong, but writers write way more than what actually gets published. And I think everyone knows that, right? So I'm sure that you've written tons of things that haven't been published. But in order to get to that refined work, you need to write, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
And one of the interesting, sorry, go ahead.
And a lot of things. I've started writing something for one book that ended up in another book because it didn't quite fit what I was doing, but I sort of set it aside, and then maybe a year or two later, I go, oh yeah, well, I was writing it, and it fits better in another project that I'm doing. So you're absolutely right about the writing. You just keep doing it.
Yeah, and I think that there's a big correlation with that in business, because another interesting thing that I thought of while you were speaking was, so Seth Godin, who is arguably one of the best marketers, at least writings of marketing. He has some incredible books on the thought process behind marketing. One of the things that I remember clear as day that he had talked about in one of his books was, he said, you don't have a good idea problem. Okay, like a lot of people say, oh, I don't have any good ideas. And he said, you don't have a lack of good idea problem. You have a lack of ideas, period, problem. Meaning, like, you have a lack of bad ideas. You have a lack of mediocre ideas. You have a lot. And basically what he was saying was, in order for us to have that curiosity and have surges of creativity, we have to go through tons and tons of ideas in order to get to those good ideas. And it just made me think, when you were talking about breaking down the impossible, it's really empowering people to have that creative culture where they can say, you know, I don't really think this is working, but I think if we did X, Y, and Z, it may work. And maybe that is an okay idea with what they're saying. And then based on processing, it becomes a good idea. And I think that there's a lot that can be taken from the process of writing that we can utilize in business for sure. So I really appreciate you mentioning that, especially from the lens of impossible, breaking it down to improbable, and going on from there. Now, I do want to shift gears a little bit, Joe, because I want to talk a little bit about more of the nuts and bolts with your writings. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to have this conversation was I had reached out to you after finishing the work that you had mentioned, Not Spoken of the Soul. And I read the book. I was on an airplane. I was actually flying to Sacramento, California from Philadelphia. And I was reading the book, and the flight was so unbelievably quick because I got so immersed in your book. And I think a big part of it, I was trying to figure out why. Why was I so enthralled with this? And what was really interesting to me is your ability to focus on the five senses. And I could see this throughout your book, right? So I don't know if you do this subconsciously, or if you, and I'm definitely going to ask you and try to figure this out, or if you do it directly, but I could see elements of, you can taste, you can see, you can hear, you can smell, you can have all these different senses within your work. And then what was really fascinating to me was all of the different scenes in your book that were the most riveting, on the edge of your seat scenes, all happened around a table, which I found really interesting. And maybe that was because the scenes that you go into and talk about at the different diners, obviously there's tables there. So I don't know if you purposely did that, or based on all of the different things that you've read and you've written, that it just naturally happens. But have you thought about it in that way, where when you're writing these different scenes, you're focused on the five senses and you're focused on having these really intriguing things happen around a table?
Yeah, that's a lot, and I do try to. Whenever I'm trying to create a scene that is purposely designed to move the book forward, to move the story forward. Okay, one of the things that I like to do is to draw in the people that need to move it forward and get them sort of into a cluster, if you will. Okay. And then start talking, and then start engaging with them to find out, okay, what do we need to, what's going on with you? What do we need to move this forward? Are you going to be instrumental in moving this forward? Maybe you're not. Maybe you will be. But there's this sense of sort of drawing them into a kind of a confined area, and then getting into it, if you will. Okay. One of my themes, one of the things, and this is a very consistent theme in a lot of the writing that I do, is I've always been very intrigued about the notion of redemption, and about how people have fall from graces and then have to go and redeem themselves if that's what they seek to do. And that's a very personal, deep deeply abiding experience, if you will. So the tighter you can draw people in, the more you can confine them. I think the more there is a tendency to talk about what it is that they think they need to do. What is that journey going to entail? One of my favorites is the you talk about the myth of Percival, for instance, and the Fisher King, and where the hero has to take a correct action or make a correct response instinctively, and that passing the test will bring honor and riches and fame. Failing the test will bring shame and dishonor. And for instance, in Not Spoken of the Soul, I chose a reporter because a reporter is not only a person who has to write about something, but in this particular case, he is a person who has to know how to listen to people. He has to know how to take in information, process it, and then put it out there in a way where he's really telling people, here's what I heard, here's what I believe is happening, and being able to do that. And I find that by drawing people into smaller environments, it's easier to do that. If you recall in my book, my main character has a very big fall from grace, just like Percival did. Percival's fall from grace in the Fisher King was he was unable to answer the question. He possessed the Grail, but he couldn't answer the question, whom does the Grail serve? And not being able to answer that, he failed the test. And then what did Percival do? He had to go out and he had to redeem himself. And then later in the story, he gets a second chance at going back to the Fisher King, to the palace, and being able to now be worthy of holding the Grail because now he has the answer to that. Well, it's the same thing with my character. The question that he couldn't answer was, whom does the Journal serve? The Journal was the newspaper that he wrote for. He manipulated and abused his power as a communicator. He ended up telling lies, if you will, and he abused a very instinctive responsibility that he had as a reporter to translate what he heard into truth, into communicating what people were thinking. And what did he do? He had to then go find a way to redeem himself. And if you notice, the last chapter of the book is him finally going back to sort of his version of the Fisher King's palace, if you will, to reclaim the Grail, because in the end, my main character does discover who the Journal serves. So there's a lot. I could probably sit and talk about this for hours with people if they wanted to engage, because it's something that I'm just so fascinated about. I'm fascinated about this whole sense of how we gain redemption, and how we sort of come back from failures. And the key to all of it is I always remember something Mary Pickford once said, the great silent film actress. She often said, failure is not in the falling down; it's in the not getting up. And that's the story that I try to tell to people. You didn't fail if you fell, but if you don't get up, you did. And that's the message that I try to convey. And sometimes I can only do that in small groups in my book, because I don't know if large groups of people are open to that message. So I choose to communicate in smaller groups of people.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And I think that is extremely powerful, because I think we have a tremendous ability to connect with others through vulnerability and through talking about the lows and not just the highs. And as you know, the hero's journey, and for anyone listening, the hero's journey developed by Joseph Campbell, who was an American professor, has been adopted by a lot of different movie outfits. So Pixar was notorious for utilizing the hero's journey. And then when Disney bought out Pixar, Disney started using it more and more. And then Disney bought Marvel and Star Wars. And now it seems like a lot of the movies that are coming out now utilize the hero's journey. And not to get into all the nuts and bolts of the hero's journey, but there is a period of falling down. There is a period of the hero, the main character, reaching his or her arm up and reaching for that mentor, that the mentor pulls them over the wall and it becomes the new reality. And that's really what you do, is you take the reader through a roller coaster, ups and downs, and that's what really captivates people. But I also think that redemption, that vulnerability is so moving, and it really connects people to that story. And I want to shift gears again, because I really want to figure this piece out, and I think this will be really helpful to people listening. Is you mentioned earlier writers write. And I think that there's a lot to be said about that. And what's interesting, to give you a brief story, if you will, I was a wrestler for quite some time. I wrestled for about 10 years. And every single summer, my grandfather sent me to Lehigh University's wrestling camp. And I started going, I believe I was in middle school when he started sending me, and I went all the way up through college. I mean, I was doing all kinds of stuff with Lehigh University. They had one of the best college wrestling teams in the country. And there was a wrestler there who was unbelievably good. He was one of the best wrestlers in the country. And he would wrestle the best, and he would he would dominate. And I remember pulling him aside, asking him, how in the world did you get so good? Tell me about your weightlifting routine. And he said, I don't really weightlift. And I said, well, tell me about your jump rope routine. And he said, well, I don't really jump rope. And I said, well, tell me about this, and tell me about your running, and tell me about all these different things. And he said, I don't really focus on those. All I do is wrestle. I wrestle for hours and hours and hours a day. And that's why I position myself to being ranked number one in the country. And that really stuck with me, because at that moment, during that conversation, I believe I was either a sophomore or junior in high school. And I was so obsessed with weightlifting and running and jump rope and all these different things that had nothing to do with wrestling. And basically his advice to me was wrestle, wrestle, wrestle. And then being on the mat, you're going to continue to get better. And it was really good advice. So when you said writers write, there's a lot of people that are going to listen to this, that they have this, I guess, glorious expectation of writing, where they see writing and they so desperately want to publish work, but they're really struggling. And I think there's a lot to be said about writers write. And what I'm hearing you say, Joe, is that even if people start writing in smaller form, maybe it's an article, or maybe it's a blog post, or maybe it's a short story, that repetition and that doing it over and over again, they're gonna fine tune those skills, and they're gonna be able to almost look at it like a puzzle piece. Because you even mentioned earlier in this discussion that there are times where you write something and then you even use it for a different work, right? Not writing from start to finish, but really building out those puzzle pieces. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because I know there's a lot of people that they hear that you're an author and you have published work and you're in the process of publishing more, and they may be flabbergasted by that, because you have an intensive job during the day and you're still able to do what you're passionate about when it comes to writing. So what would you recommend that people turn to? So you said writers write. Did you start writing articles, and did you start writing like short stories and then build from there? And based on everything you were reading with history, you started to utilize that in short form? How did you, because you mentioned you didn't just start writing books. How did that process happen? And what was the first, can you pinpoint like the first few things that you wrote and what they were?
Sure. I looking back, probably as early as I'm going to say high school. One one of my first attractions to writing was poetry. I got very intrigued with writing poetry. I actually felt that I had actually gotten quite good at it, and was recognized a couple of times in high school as sort of published in student publications and that sort of thing. Poetry, as much as I enjoyed it, it didn't really fulfill sort of, I couldn't scratch the itch with the poetry, so to speak, okay? There was still a bigger itch that needed to be filled there. So I started, I started writing essays on certain topics. I would pick a topic about something, and then I would just sort of spill my heart out about that particular topic, and not for any other reason other than just to give myself some experience in writing something about a topic, how I felt about it, how I saw it. You know, musicians, for instance. One of the things that you could kind of draw as a comparison here, a lot of composers publish pieces called etudes, and etudes are meant to be nothing but practice pieces. They're not written for the music. They're written for someone to play this because it'll help you practice. And that's almost the kind of sense that I come at it with. Do something to go and practice. One of the things that I really enjoy doing is sometimes I'll go on the internet and I'll start looking at pictures. And I look at all kinds of pictures. And then if there's one that hits me, what I do is I write a story about it. I build a story around it. One picture that hit me recently was I saw this wonderful picture of a woman walking on she was just walking on a very busy street. It could have been New York City, and her head was down. You could kind of tell by the picture she was deep in thought, and with all these millions of people around her, you could sense her solitude. That she was so into herself that she just didn't know what else was going on, and I wrote a story about that. I wrote a story about what happened to her. Why was she feeling that way? What drove her to that place? No, I didn't do it for any other reason other than the fact that I wanted to write. And so people, again, anyone looking to write, you need to do that, because quite frankly, it's the only way you're going to find your voice. I will tell you that early on, I struggled with a lot of my writing because I felt that I was trying too hard to be somebody else. I was trying to write to, oh, well, people read this, they won't like it. And I got past all of that. I was able to finally start saying to myself, hey, don't write for anybody else. Write for yourself. Write it because you enjoy it, because you like it. Because what it does is it helps you practice at what it is that you need to do to get better at your art, if you will. I remember, I'm pretty sure it was in Madrid, Spain. There's a mural there that was a large mural that was done by Picasso to commemorate the Spanish Civil War during the 30s, right before the start of the Second World War. And you look at this thing and you realize, well, he didn't just wake up one day and go to this wall and start painting this mural. It's not what he did. In fact, what he did do was he produced thousands and thousands of etchings and drawings, and they were all over the place before he even put a brush to the mural that he was doing. And I kind of liken that kind of experience to writing. you're going to, if you really want to do it, you're going to have to produce those thousands of pages, if you will, and out of which you might be able to glean maybe sort of the beginning of a story, if you will, being able to sort of tie a story together around an event, if you will, much like I do with my work, because as I said, my preferred genre is historical fiction. So for me, the journey has been sort of up and down. There are periods where I don't write because maybe there's something going on in my life and I'm a little distracted from it. But the one thing that I find very interesting about it is that once I do get back to it, again, I'll go back to this very clear thing for me that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, was the wonderful place that it allows me to go to. I can only hope that other writers find that same place, find the joy and the peace and the distraction, if you will, that being a writer or being involved in any artistic pursuit should be able to provide you, free of any sense of, well, I need to write this because I got to publish it, or I got to do this, or I got to do that. Free yourself from all that nonsense. It's absolutely absurd to think about that, because it gets in the way of your creative process, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. I really appreciate you focusing on that curiosity that turns to a passion, and then allowing ourselves to be creative. Because I think there are a lot of people out there that they put these expectations on themselves, that they may have a passion for writing and expressing themselves through the written word, but then they put this expectation that it has to be published, and I have to do this and I have to do that. And I really feel that it stifles creativity. And I feel that you had mentioned about the importance of continuing that curiosity and allowing yourself to be creative. So thank you so much for sharing that. And Joe, I know you're an extremely busy person, so I know you have a lot more that you need to do today. I want to thank you for your time and for everything that you had talked to us about. I think we touched on a lot of things. You had talked about redemption. You had talked about writer's right. You had talked about writing as much as you can, and then the editing process. You had talked about how you break down things that many perceive as impossible and make them improbable. And then once they're improbable, how to utilize creativity to make something a reality. We talked about a lot of different things, and I appreciate everything that you had mentioned today. So in closing, where can people find you? For people that are listening to this, where can they find you? Where can they find your work?
Well, I'm on Amazon. I'm on Barnes and Nobles. I'm on most of the sites. My books are for sale there. One of the things that I always do, and this was against the advice of my publisher, but I always put my email address in my book covers because I love to hear from my readers, and I get a lot of emails. I get a lot of people who read my book and they want to either give me a review, if you will, or they want to challenge me on something. I make some very controversial observations about things that people don't agree with, and so they kind of want to challenge me, and I love that, because that's being creative. Okay, that's the beginning of the creative process, when you start to challenge sort of conventional wisdom, if you will. Don't get caught up in the conventional wisdom of things. Break out of that and challenge thought. So I can be reached through primarily, I guess, my email address, which is dantonio.joseph@yahoo.com. And other than that, as I said, inside my book covers, they can find my email address, and I love to hear from my readers.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. That really shows people just how open you are to open lines of communication and talking and processing through your work. And I really appreciate that. Again, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Joe, for being a part of this. I know everyone that's listening to this got a ton of value out of that. So thank you so much. Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. If you have a story that you would like to share, feel free to drop an email to matt@mattzahn.com with the subject line Stories with Traction. Also, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, where I share tons of resources on how you can be a better storyteller. Remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.